back to it. So, executive summary. This is also going to be quite a long read. In most countries, land inequality is growing. Hello from Beijing. I can't read your name, but thanks for the chat. Welcome to the stream. In most countries, land inequality is growing. Worse, new measures and why is it doing that? Measures and analysis published in this synthesis report show that land inequality is significantly higher than previously reported. This trend directly threatens the livelihood of an estimated 2.5 billion people worldwide involved in smallholder agriculture. Land inequality is also central to many other forms of inequality related to wealth, power, gender, health, and environment, and is foundationally linked to the contemporary global crisis of democratic decline. Climate change, global health security, pandemics, mass migration, unemployment, it's all very interconnected. Beyond its direct effects on smallholder agriculture, it's clear that land inequality undermines stability and development of sustainable societies, affecting all of us in almost every way, in almost every aspect of our lives. Make sure to thumbs up the stream, by the way. That does help get more viewers like our friend from Beijing in. Thanks for that. God, I feel like such a cliche YouTuber saying that. But like and thumbs up, subscribe to the stream. Alright, let's get back to it. Despite the centrality of land inequality in so many global challenges, and despite global recognition of the importance of secure and equitable land rights in sustainable development goals and voluntary guidelines on the responsible governance and tenure of land, fisheries, and forest, inequality in rights to land and distribution of benefits from it are on the increase, while unsustainable land use is placing a huge burden on those able to bear it. This report sheds new light on the scale, speed, and growth of this growing land inequality. It provides the most comprehensive picture available today, informed by 17 specifically commissioned research papers, as well as analysis of existing data and literature. It lays out details on causes and consequences of land inequality, analyzes potential solutions, and offers a potential pathway to change. While there's still significant gaps in our knowledge, not least about the extent of corporate land and financial interest in the world's land, we're going to get to that next. It's clear that land inequality is greater and is increasing much more rapidly than we thought. The need to address this is urgent, and it's in all our best interest to do so. I don't think I really need to read the why land inequality matters bit. As we said, fundamentally related to political inequality, reduces incomes, causes consequences for climate change, strong connections between land inequality, changes in agricultural practices, in global health and spread of disease. COVID is the latest zoonotic disease to emerge from a combination of unsanitary animal farming and pressures on the land and wildlife populations, exacerbated by the same diverse drivers that fuel land inequality. COVID has also contributed to land inequality through dispossession in more heavily policed societies. Migration has long been a strong coping strategy. This leads to brain drain for many nations because farmers will move to other countries where they can farm and they can have land. And it is also related to social exclusion and intergenerational injustice. Land inequality is bigger than we thought, 41% bigger than we thought. The traditional measurement of land inequality, the Gini coefficient, which we went over in the previous article for land distribution, based on household surveys, records ownership and area of holdings by size, provides useful long-term perspective on land inequality across countries. However, it paints only a partial picture that does not take into account the multidimensional nature of land, tenure, quality, and assets, nor does it reflect the multiple land holdings or actual control. I said agriculture so many times already over land, nor does it include landless farming, which is grazing, and In the framework of this land inequality initiative, these data have now been complemented by innovative methodologies implemented using a sample of 17 countries. The results indicate that land inequality is much worse than we previously thought. Today, it is estimated that there are approximately 608 million farms in the world, and most are still family farms. However, 1% of farms operate more than 70% of the world's farmland. They're integrated into the corporate food system, while 80% of small holdings of less than 2 hectares that are generally excluded from global food chains. Patterns are vary significantly from region to region. Since 1980, in all regions, land concentration has either been increasing significantly in North America, Europe, Asia, and the Pacific, and a decreasing trend has been reversed in Africa and Latin America. In most low-income countries, we see an increased number of farms in combination with smaller and smaller farm sizes, while higher-income countries produce large farms or getting bigger. By taking into the account of multiple ownership of plots, land values, and the landless population, research conducted for this project concludes that land inequality has thus far been significantly underestimated. Overall, across the sampled countries, new measurements show that the wealthiest 10% of rural populations capture 60% of agricultural land, while the poorest 50%, who generally depend on agriculture, capture only 3% of the land, compared to traditional census data that shows increase in rural land inequality of 41%, when agricultural land and landlessness are taken into account, an increase of 24% to that 41%, if value only is considered. These new estimates also provide important insights into international patterns of land inequality. Although Latin America remains the most unequal region, land inequality in Asian and African countries sampled increase proportionally more when land value and landless populations are included. Asian countries that appear moderately equal under traditional measures, such as India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, have among the highest levels of inequality when land value and the landless population are included. China and Vietnam, by contrast, display higher levels of land inequality among landowners than South Asia and Africa. But really? Okay. But land concentration is only slightly higher when land value and landless households are considered. Africa has the lowest level of land area inequality among landowners, but this rises significantly when land values and landless populations are included. The findings on land inequality reported here are almost certainly an underestimate, as none of the available data shows how much land is controlled or operated by corporate entities. Funds, even through their operations, clearly involve significant interest in land across different countries. The less visible forms of control do not necessarily require ownership. Contract farming, for example, can incorporate land into supply chains, creating new dependencies and perpetuating extractive models. There is increasing corporate concentration of ownership and control throughout the agri-food sector, which influences the way that land is used. Furthermore, the growing role of financial markets and actors treat the land as asset classes and can significantly change the way that control is used. Again, this also harms the land and harms the people living around it and on it. In the agri-food sector, corporate organization is linked to the industrial modes of primary production, which seeks advantages of scale. In addition, throughout horizontal and vertical integrations, these actors control large sections of specific value chains, often all the way from seeds via input to retailers, enabling them to exercise significant control over the land and reap the maximum possible value and contribute even more to land inequality. Mouthful. Concentration of control is compounded by increased interest in agricultural land from the financial sector. Parts of the world's farmland are now considered financial assets with no known physical owner, subject to decision-making processes that may be external to the farm instruments such as shareholdings and the use of derivative value detach investment from the material base and can bring greater instability to the agricultural markets and put speculative pressures on land and agricultural products. Now, speculative pressure. I want to talk about that just for a little bit, side tangent. Corporations treating land as a speculative investment, as in a bet on the stock market, is not just a problem with farming, but is also one of the major reasons why there is housing problems, housing crises all over the world, is because of speculative interests, is because of corporations and the wealthy, which really are kind of interconnected, buying land, buying housing, buying farms, and not using them because the land value will go up because there's less supply and the demand stays the same. And then once that value goes up, they sell it for a return on their investment. This practice should be outlawed entirely when it comes to things like housing, when it comes to things like agriculture, when it comes to things like medicine production. But that's a thing for another time. Side tangent. So, complex corporate and financial structures and cross-shareholdings mean that clear lines of responsibility for land use and management are becoming harder to discern, just as they are becoming more important. It's also difficult to hold investors to account for their economic, social, and environmental impacts when primary investors are unknown and geographically, institutionally remote from the land in question. Solutions for effective change. I think we can get to this part later, but important here is it's important to emphasize that land redistribution efforts alone will fail to ensure sustainable livelihoods, let alone prosperity. A range of measures is needed, including redistribution programs, regulatory reforms, taxation, and accountability measures, not only in relation to land, but across the agri-food sector. From inputs to retailing, such interventions will entail redressing the power imbalances affecting land in the agri-food sector, while also supporting more equitable relations between people and their land. Again, this relates not only to food, but also to housing and to medicine. These things should not be speculative investments. These things should not be commodities to be bought and sold. Food, sure, grown food can be grown and sold. Medicine can be created and sold. But the production and the land that is used to produce them should not be a commodity in and of itself and should not be used for speculative investment. Now, I want to get to... No. We've kind of read the introduction already. So, land inequality is complex and multi-dimensional, encompassing a number of concepts, measures, and facts. The synthesis report breaks new ground by bringing many facets of land inequality and analyzing them comprehensively. Research presented in this report draws on a wider range of measures than is usually applied to land inequality and examines how land inequality links the global pressures. Thank you for that. Foreign buyers being banned from purchasing properties in Canada is actually a very so I think if you are purchasing a property in a country that you do not live in, it has to be for you like Canada. Me as an American cannot buy land or property in Canada, but I do think that I should be able to have a house in Canada, but only if I'm regularly using it. I don't think that big corporations or even just wealthy people should be able to, like what Canada did, banning it, be able to just buy land and just leave it there, or buy buildings, buy properties, buy houses that they don't use, or even if they are renting these properties out, I still don't think that should be allowed. I think there are, of course, always there's always exceptions, but the way to address that is with good, clear regulation by the government. And I do think what Canada did was a very good thing, and I think it is helping. As a Canadian, would you think that it is helping with housing prices, the ability to afford homes, for example? I personally think it does. We'll go into this actually as soon as I'm done with this article with Australia specifically. I have a couple points to make about foreign ownership of land and resources and how that affects a multifaceted thing there. But we have to get through this massive article first, because land inequality in any country is multifaceted, and we have to understand how and why before we can get deeper into the details. So, historically, land inequality has been measured in terms of difference of land ownership. However, thorough investigation of land inequality requires us to study many more dimensions of land use: the size of the value of the land that people have access of, the level of security of tenure that people have, the quality of the land, its characteristics, and the assets that may be on it, the actual control that people have, including decision-making power over said land, and the control of benefits derived from the land, including the ability to appropriate value from it. Land inequality is both vertical and horizontal. Vertical inequality focuses on the distribution of land among individuals, usually owners or those who directly control land. This is not enough. It's also essential to consider horizontal land inequality on the basis of factors such as gender, ethnicity, and culture. 1% of property value tax for vacant homes is great. I think that tax should be higher. I also think that should extend to not just homes, but commercial properties. Sometimes when you walk around a city, you'll see just empty buildings in the financial district. Like, you're walking around in whatever your city is, I'm sure that you've seen this, just an empty building that could be used, that could be contributing to the city, and yet it sits there unused. It sits there and it looks bad, it looks ugly, it makes people less likely to want to walk around in the city because things look derelict. It decreases the amount of money that's being spent in these commercial areas, because vacant buildings means less stores, means less money being spent. I do want to pose that with, I'm not a capitalist. I am a socialist. So I'm looking at this through the scope of capitalism, because I can't just snap my fingers and then turn the world socialist. So we have to do little things one at a time. But like our friend from Canada, which I really wish I could pronounce something as a name instead of just calling you our friend from Canada, but introducing laws like a fine for vacant buildings is a great way to get started on fixing this issue. And that should apply more than just homes. It should be commercial buildings. It should also be arable farmland, or any land, really. If it's owned and it's unused and it's usable, then it should definitely be taxed and fined. So, Gender inequality and land rights. We know this, but let's just open this graph. So, women who own land alone, percentage of women. Chad, good for you. At 50%, hold on. Oh, never mind. Chad, very bad for you. Comoros is actually probably the best for women who own land, but as you can see, much of the land ownership in Africa, Asia, North America, and South America is owned by men. Los Federales, thank you, I will remember that. Nice name. I believe so. I remember something about it in my brain, but too much going on right now to actually obtain that memory. Land inequality is not inevitable, but is a result of both political decisions, market forces, and a combination of both. I also think that there is a factor of culture that comes into this, because many of these countries have, as the rest of the world does, a culture that prioritizes men over women, and therefore, like as we saw in the last article, many women who produce most of the labor on family farms don't get to own them, because when they get widowed, the ownership of the farm passes to their son rather than them. And that is a combination of political decisions and cultural, like a cultural foundation of prioritizing men. Land inequality is shaped by economic, political, social, and spatial environmental factors, which in turn influences... I know it means the feds in Spanish, but there's an association to something. I'm blanking on it, but I watched a video on it that included that name sometime in the last month. I'll look into that for next time. This interconnectedness means that addressing land inequality requires all-encompassing cross-sectoral approach. It means that tackling land inequality will have a wide range of positive implications for the planet broadly. Central to other forms of inequality, the embeddedness of land inequality with other inequalities, and the land inequality with the global crisis and trends involve a complex system that's all interconnected. Here we go. Here's the, I want big image. So, land inequality at the center. All of these different factors, political inequality, economic inequality, spatial inequality, environmental inequality, and social inequality, they all have connections to the land and to themselves. So, political inequality, large-scale land and agricultural investments, unequal political power relations, etc., colonial legacy, elite power base, and this democracy crisis is directly related to the world shifting to the right. Now, then we look at social inequality, and you can see that a lot of it overlaps with the political inequality. Obviously, unequal education and capacitation of opportunities, poor health and services, sanitations, inequality for indigenous peoples, lack of social cohesion and trust, gender inequality, youth exclusion, food insecurity, intergenerational injustice. And then, further in, we come to environmental inequality, climate and environmental crisis, deforestation, natural disasters, environmental degradation, soil erosion, water stress, agricultural expansion, monocultural practices, which I went over earlier, and land biodiversity. But you can see that this also interconnects with global health insecurities, all through social injustice, environmental inequality, land inequality, and spatial injustice. Now, spatial injustice is unequal territorial growth and development, international inequalities, displacement and evictions, spatial segregation, rural-urban divides, urban inequality. And this connects entirely to mass migration. You can see all of this graph is affected by that. And then economic inequality, which overlaps with both spatial and the political inequality, which is unemployment, exploitation and skewed labor relations, unequal wealth and asset accumulation, rent control and extraction models, decreased labor productivity, increased poverty, unequal income, less growth. All of these things are related to land inequality. Now, we can go through all of this, but I think that graph really kind of covered most of it. So in rural societies, elites may control formal and informal decision-making processes over land of the poor and smaller farmers and landowners. From land accumulation within undemocratic tribal systems in South Africa, in a 2008 study, to land corruption in the highest political levels of Kenya from a 2012 study, to the perversion of public land distribution landed elites in Colombia from a 2020 study, examples are numerous all over the world. These unequal structures often link to rent-seeking behavior from the public, or what is often considered public assets such as land in collective tenure systems. When institutional quality is low, the rich wield even stronger political influence. Weak institutions, together with underrepresented poor segments of the population, lead to systemic underinvestment in policies that benefit the poor. Smallholders, family farms instead incentivize tax systems to benefit large-scale domestic international farm enterprises. Again, this interconnects with everything else. I'm going to go into the more political aspects of this in further streams, but I really wanted to start off with food and land because it's really the foundation of everything. Everything comes out from here. In March 2004, after more than 2 years of consultations with development partners, civil society, producer groups, and several ministries within government, Senegal launched the Loi d'Orientation Agro-Silvo-Pastoral, or the LOASP, a grand vision for agriculture which promoted modernization of the country over the next 20 years, with a strong focus on family farming, the reduction of poverty inequalities between farmers, between rural and urban populations. However, in 2008, before this had been fully implemented, the then president, Abdoulaye Wade, inaugurated the Great Agricultural Offensive for Food and Abundance amid food insecurity worries precipitated by a poor harvest and volatile world markets. The aim stated Ghana was for Senegal to attain self-sufficiency by 2015, predominantly by attracting private large investments. By 2010, over 657,000 hectares, or around 17% of Senegal's arable land, have been allocated to 17 private firms, mainly concentrated in the northern parts of the country. 10 of the firms were Senegalese, and the rest were foreign. The Ghana case illustrates how easily powerful elites, both national and international, are able to ignore inclusive policies in favor of alternative developmental models based on large-scale land acquisition. It's a disgusting practice. Land inequality and unemployment. We've been on this before. When you can't farm your land, you lose your job, and then you migrate. Or you try and find another job, but a lot of these people, they've been doing this for generations. In longer term, land inequality is detrimental to human development, socio-political stability, and environmental sustainability. Further studies find that the land inequality perpetuates poverty, well beyond the agricultural sector and creates unequal distribution of industrial assets and persists over time. In rural societies, power and wealth may also be increased by means of accumulation, by dispossession, and the extraction of profit through multiple forms of rent capture from the land and labor. Cited studies illustrative of this process is the global large-scale land acquisitions trend that surged in 2010, and this land rush led to 26.7 million hectares of mainly collectively held land being acquired by national and international companies, generally with the support and engagement of domestic elites. Those driven off the land, whether through forces of accumulation, dispossession, or environmental disaster, lose their major source of livelihood. Unemployment and reduced income are therefore results of land inequality. And remember, if you spent your whole life being a farmer, you're 37 years old, and your land has just been dispossessed, and you can no longer use it to farm. You are now unemployed. What jobs can you really get? Especially if you live in a rural area. What is there that you are trained to do aside from farm? You can maybe farm for the companies that have bought your land, or taken it rather, but that's not guaranteed. There's no structure to this aside from profit seeking. That's it. That's the only structure that exists with the corporate acquisition of land, whether it be national or international companies. When large farms dominate the agricultural sector, labor becomes more salaried and labor relations are often skewed and casualized, pushing real wages down. Women are particularly vulnerable to casualization of labor on farms. This means in most nations, casual labor is not defined as full-time or part-time, which means you don't have the protections of, not being able to just get fired, not receiving any benefits, whether your nation requires a corporation to have health insurance for its full-time employees, for example. Casual labor doesn't get that. While increased industrialization as average farm sizes increase reduces employment opportunities overall. Depending on the type of production, labor absorption rates are from the most labor-intensive types of production, such as horticulture, to 25 and even 100 times for cereal, for example, less in industrialized farm models compared with family farms. In many low-income countries where agriculture is still the largest employer and few other employers exist, the unfettered realization of this trend risks creating a social and economic disaster. This leads to mass migration. What are you going to do? You can't get any other job and you don't have the land. Now, let's get to climate. Climate change is a driver of global inequality. Included in land inequality is already driving down agricultural productivity and driving some people from their land altogether. Conversely, land inequality is associated with environmental pressures that contribute to climate change, such as the growth of large-scale environmental damages, monocultures that maximize economies of scale. At the same time, the more sustainable land use practices of small-scale farmers, family farmers, and indigenous peoples are threatened by land evictions, deforestation, biodiversity loss, and excessive pressure on natural resources such as water and soil. Although mitigation actions such as promotion of green energy and hydroelectric projects or biofuel productions may have positive effects on climate change, they can push people off their land, divert or deplete water sources, and cause deforestation and environmental destruction in and of themselves. For example, the example of monocultures for biofuel. Such pressures will likely be magnified by the increasing demand for land for carbon sequestration, linked to the achievement of net zero emission targets by most countries and companies. In this sense, even environmental policies aiming to respond to climate change, if not designed and implemented carefully, can exacerbate land inequality and exacerbate environmental damage in and of themselves. In Brazil, the increasing interest in land, especially in areas where agricultural frontiers are expanding, the agribusiness is advancing, is driving the dispossession of traditional communities, including by force and sometimes violent and illegal methods. The transfer of public lands to private actors for large-scale monoculture has led to contamination of the environment and privatization of access to water. For example, in Santa Filomena, in Piauí State, large-scale soy production has led to the contamination and depletion of water sources, depriving surrounding rural communities of good quality water. This is actually quite important to the next thing I wanted to talk about, but I am not sure that we're going to have time to get to it today. Try our best. Alright. At country levels, this has generated violence and conflict, with 1,833 cases of conflict and related to land and water in 2019 alone. Over the past decade, Brazil has also recorded one of the highest murder rates in the world of land and environmental defenders. In Colombia, establishment of agribusiness has reduced production of sustainable food crops like traditional tubers, pulses, and grain, has limited many rural communities to access to land and water. In Monte de Maria and Oriente Antiguo, where oil palm and floriculture for export flourish in the favorable climate, widespread use of agrochemicals, and particularly in the case of flower production, water contamination led to negative consequences for the livelihood of small-scale farmers and agribusiness workers. We went over how diseases can spread from monocultures before, but COVID-19 has further exposed inequalities faced by land disadvantaged groups such as indigenous people, lower caste, elderly, women, youth, and migrants, as well as casual workers. Land inequality diminishes resilience to disease shocks, and at a household level may lead to a loss of shelter, lack of access to infrastructure and services, traditional community networks, and institutions of social reciprocity. Women's resilience and coping strategies are limited by weaker land rights, which puts them at even greater disadvantage in situations, with a knock-on effect on the children and youth of those households. Now, again, migration is one of the main adaptation strategies for people affected by land inequality. Poverty, displacement, poor living conditions, social exhaustion, lack of opportunities often arise from unequal access to land. Migration is also a response to conflict, climate change, and unstable democracies, all related in one way or another, as we've seen, to land inequality. That graph, the circle graph from earlier, is actually quite amazing. Overall land inequality, through its interconnectedness with social, economic, and environmental and spatial inequalities, influences people's resilience to react, and when you can't, it forces people to migrate. In Costa Rica between 1984 and 2014, the land area used for export crops such as pineapple, palm oil, melon, and orange, and cassava increased from 26,000 to 151,000 hectares. This was accompanied by a greater concentration of land ownership and reduced state support for small and medium-scale farmers. The expansion of the agribusiness has also seen the increase of the labor migration from neighboring countries, with about 30% of Costa Rica's agricultural workforce coming from Nicaragua, where demographic growth from 1960 to 2000s, small-sized farms, and landlessness have been strong drivers for migration. These workers are often hired informally, underpaid, while Costa Rican rural workers have shifted to non-agricultural activities in the urban sector, contributing to uncontrolled urbanization. Now, I've touched on this already before, but when you are a farmer and you lose the ability to farm, you go and you find a different job if you can, and if not, you migrate. But if you can find a job and you don't migrate, it is usually an urban job that pays you a terrible wage, that exploits your labor, and then the big farms that threw you off your land underpay. I don't like the term illegal immigrants, but migrants. Migrants that come from countries that have even worse standards are often exploited. You can see this in America, for example, where immigrants from South America come to America. They do a lot of the agricultural work for big national corporations, yet they are underpaid, receive no benefits, are often at risk of deportation if they are not legal. The corporations don't often sponsor their citizenships and are subject to abuse, not only by their employer, but by the people on the land, that, like, in the country that they're migrating to. Like, you see this in Texas, where there's gangs of people roaming around looking for immigrants from, like, Mexico or the rest of South America. They just mix them all together and call them Mexicans for some fucking reason. And they have nothing to defend themselves with because they can't call the police, or the police are just going to deport them in most cases. Not in every case, but in most cases. Similar trends were evident in Peru, particularly in the municipality of Viru. Since the Peruvian government embraced neoliberalism in the early 1990s, large corporate agribusinesses have shaped the country's agricultural sector, largely to the detriment of subsistence and small family farmers. In the new constitution of 1993, with Law 26505, known as Ley de Tierras, land law, and Law 27360, Ley de Promoción del Sector Agrario, Law of Agrarian Sector Promotion. I'm bad at speaking other languages. The state approved policies that fueled land concentration and large-scale corporate agriculture. This also led to increased use of migrant and seasonal labor, with high rotations of workers, temporary contracts, and low wages. In Viru, migrants, mostly coming from Peru's poor highlands, are forced into labor and living conditions that aggravate land pressures and marginalize, further feeding the spiral of inequality. Rural women and youth face multiple challenges linked to land inequality. Access to land and employment prospects is exacerbated by climate change. We've been over this. In particular, land inequality structurally reduces opportunities for younger rural generations, especially girls, to improve their lives in the long term. This negative spiral is reinforced as women and youth are systematically excluded from policy decisions, including in relation to land, overlapping with other forms of exclusion based on wealth, place of residence, race, and ethnicity. This really does come down to a class thing, but women do get the raw end of the stick oftentimes. But the cause of this, the effects are on everybody, and the cause is by class. Overcoming wider inequalities is impossible without addressing land inequality. The centrality of land inequality in many global problems is clear. Tackling this issue, therefore, has the potential to deliver significantly positive outcomes for the planet and for humanity. Addressing land inequality will not only redress asset and wealth inequality, but will reduce rent seeking by a minority, improve income equality, and enable more inclusive and sustainable developments. This is not possible under our current global system. This requires massive, massive systemic change, more social policies. I'm not even saying full-on socialism, but more social policies. and significantly higher amounts of regulation on industry, corporate actors, higher taxation of the wealthy, and the redistribution of wealth. This can strengthen democracies by establishing more broadly decision making among landed populations with greater participation and transparency. The direct relationship of land inequality with environmental damage makes addressing it imperative and achieving environmental sustainability and global biodiversity. All necessary to combat climate change and health crises, all of the above stepping stones towards more resilient, sustainable and stable societies where no one is left behind. So, the shocking state of land inequality in the world. Measuring land inequality is not easy. We've been over this. The numbers do often vary. The Gini coefficient, which is the traditional method, does not account for the landless population, the ownership of several properties, etc., etc. This will go further into it. So, challenges with the traditional use of the Gini coefficient to measure land inequality towards a new methodology. Land distribution calculated using agricultural census data captures distribution of the size of farms rather than land ownership. Does not account for multiple land holdings per owner, and fail to capture the full extent of land concentration. The present Gini coefficient is generally unidimensional, not taking consideration other multidimensional complexities of land inequality, other aspects related to land inequality, quality of land, presence of assets, other resources such as water, proximity to infrastructure, markets, etc., are not measured in the census. Agricultural censuses do not distinguish between different forms of legal ownership, nor do they include corporate ownership or shareholding structures. Census data focuses only on agricultural landed households and do not account for landless households, and thus do not portray actual levels of inequality. The Gini coefficient is a synthetic measure of inequality that summarizes the entire distribution into a single number, and it thus less informative about where the important changes in distribution need to be made. So, in response to these challenges, new methodologies for measuring land inequality were developed as part of this land inequality measurement. Endeavors to integrate multidimensional nature of land inequality by combining, besides the standard quantitative size of land plots, indicator, tenure, quality of land, endowment, assets, and other indicators. To do this, they suggest using various additional data sources. A second approach by Balouz et al. In 2020, based on survey data, assessed land inequality based on land ownership by household, beyond distribution of the size of farms, factoring multiple ownership of plots, the land value as a criterion of quality of land, and also accounts for the landless. The authors implemented this methodology using samples from countries like India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, China, Vietnam, Ecuador, Guatemala, Brazil, Mexico, Peru, Burkina Faso, Ethiopia, the Gambia, Malawi, Nigeria, and Tanzania. Yeah, putting those two together is difficult. The selection of countries was a result of data availability, and although some of the most populous countries were covered in this analysis, more countries need to be covered for future research. We need global study on this, obviously. But, based on this data, open this in a larger tab. From the Gini coefficient of 0.64 in the early years of the century, land inequality decreased to 0.60 in 1982, but it again increased to 0.62 by 2017. Again, for anyone watching that hadn't seen earlier, the closer to 0 is perfect equality, 1 is full-on inequality. So, based on the Gini coefficient for land distribution, we can see that it's very, very unstable, but does in the end meet up towards global trend line in 2017. Now, calculations of the Gini coefficient for land capture and distribution, size of holdings, and private ownership data gathered by sources available online. Oh, so that is just the Gini coefficient, actually. That's not incorporating all of these other factors into it. So the largest 1% of farms operate 70% of the farmland, supplying corporate food systems. Again, we went over this. This is probably an underestimate. The 1% of farms that operate 70% of the farmland. Oh, sorry, never mind. Scratch that bit. I read that the other way around. Most of the food that is produced by small farms and generally by women. Today it's estimated there are approximately 608 million farms around the world. About 90% are family farms, which include all size of farms from the smallest ones to the largest, occupying 70 to 80% of the farmland. About 84% of farms are smaller than 2 hectares, but these operate only about 12% of the farmland with little, if any, opportunity to be part of corporate supply chains. The largest 1% of farms around the world operate more than 70% of the world's farmland. These farms form the core production for corporate food systems. Unless there is substantial policy intervention given the trends of the agricultural food system, land consolidation will inevitably increase further, and it has been. Although land inequality patterns vary significantly region to region, a consistent pattern of land consolidation emerges throughout. After 1980, in all regions, land concentration has either been increasing significantly in North America, Europe, Asia, and the Pacific, or a decreasing trend has been reversed in Africa and Latin America. We went over this before. Again, this is measured by the Gini coefficient. So, North America has seen a drastic increase in land and agricultural concentration. U.S. data shows a decline of 3.7 million farms to 2.1 million farms between 1960 and 1990, accompanied by a steady rise in average size farms from 122.6 hectares to 187 hectares over the same time period. From 1990 to 2010, the number of farms and average farm size remained fairly stable at 2.1 million farms and the average size around 175 hectares. While the total number of farms and their average size have stabilized, the number of farms larger than 500 hectares has risen from 1971 onwards, while the total number of the smallest farms, including those less than 5 hectares, has also increased in the U.S. Medium-sized farms ranging from 50 to 500 hectares have significantly decreased in number. This is increasingly polarized and unequal land distribution. Henriksen et al. In 2017 argued that the agriculture of the middle is declining and perhaps facing extinction. This goes into the ever-shrinking middle class of the United States. If small farms are remaining somewhat consistent, and large farms are remaining somewhat consistent, and mid-sized farms are decreasing in number, that means these people are now out of work. They are no longer in agriculture, because otherwise small farms would have gone up or large farms would have gone up. You can either try and get a job with one of the larger farms, which is increasingly unlikely because migrants work for cheaper and they wouldn't want to hire you. What the figures on farm size do not reveal, however, are even more substantial increases in concentration of large-scale production on a shrinking number of farms. Almost 1 million farms in the USA have less than $5,000 in sales per year, while the largest 7% account for 80% of production value. This leaves a situation where 1.3 million, or 60% of farms in the US, produce only 6.6% of the total production value. These include farms below 5 hectares, many of which are known as retirement farms or off-farm occupation farms, with owners who do not depend on agricultural production for their livelihood. Similar trend has been seen in the EU. The vast majority of smallest farms globally are in Africa and Asia, where they're essential to the livelihood of large proportions of the population. Figure 7 shows the distribution of farms and land in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. Most farms are smaller than 2 hectares. We've been over this bit. We've been over all of this. Large-scale land acquisitions and commercial pressures on land increasing inequality. In 2018, Land Matrix identified 1,000 large-scale agricultural land deals covering 26.7 million hectares of land around the globe. Africa accounts for 42% of these deals and about 10 million hectares of land, the area the size of Iceland. Even though global land rush has slowed, new acquisitions are still being recorded and contributing to pressures of rural people on the land. I do want to add here, real quick, that this doesn't just affect farming. The rush for global acquisition of land affects quite a lot of things. For example, China owns the vast majority of the world's cobalt mines, which are required for the production of electric vehicles. However, most of the world's cobalt mines are in Africa. So again, this goes back to countries that the wealthy buying land in foreign countries to exploit it for its resources. It all comes back to that. Now, the 1% extreme land concentration in Latin America and South Africa rather. The Oxfam analysis of 15 Latin American countries showed that the largest 1% of farms hold more than half of all agricultural land. The trend is similar, taking into consideration all farmers in South Africa, commercial and non-commercial. It's estimated that only 0.28% of farms produce around 80% of the value of agricultural production. This means that none of this stuff is none of this production is for the residents of South Africa. They are commodities to be sold.